to the Soil and Roots podcast, digging beneath the surface to uncover the hidden ideas that shape us, the church, and our culture. I'm Brian Fisher. This is episode 10, For What It's Worth. Alright, we've been looking at a critical crisis of disciple making in this corner of the world. This problem has caused a lot of harm in the culture, but we're primarily exploring it right now in terms of how it impacts the individual. We sometimes feel disconnected from God and others and ourselves, and we wonder if there's more to this Christian life than what we normally experience. The solution is what we at Soil and Roots call deep discipleship. It's the journey of digging into the ideas that form and shape us. These unconscious assumptions and conclusions sometimes align with our stated beliefs, but sometimes they don't. It's the college sophomore who's active in her campus ministry and sings the worship songs at church, yet finds herself in bed with various guys because her heart, desires, and ideas have been formed by things other than her Bible study. It's the elder at church who knows all of the correct doctrines, yet remains hard to approach and critical, ready to spar with anyone who doesn't align with his dogma. The most dogmatic people are often the most insecure, and that insecurity is driven by ideas deeper than their intellectual beliefs. Deep discipleship digs beneath the very good doctrine, church traditions, and service opportunities into the world of ideas. There are dozens of categories of ideas in our hearts, but here we tend to focus on our core ideas, the 6 most fundamental ideas in our soils. Ideas of identity, anthropology, value, power, purpose, and love. Who are we? What are we? What are we worth? What authority do we have? What's our purpose? And what or whom do we desire? Today we're going to get some practice at discerning a core idea from both the kingdom of darkness and the kingdom of light. One of the goals of this season is to help train us to identify ideas and how they work and what impact they have. And today will be the most in-depth look of an idea we take this whole season. We're going to explore a core idea of value, of human value. What are we worth? As we dig into this idea in detail today, here are just a few reminders. You and I are not primarily thinkers or even believers. We're primarily lovers. We're desirers. We desire to be known. We desire to be wanted. We desire to be embraced and accepted. These are good desires. The center of who we are is our hearts or our spirits. And our primary purpose as Christians is to cooperate with God in the ongoing formation of our hearts. We call this spiritual formation or discipleship. We're on a journey to be formed more like Jesus. Despite what Western thought has promoted for the past 150 years or so, our hearts are not only formed through instruction. Western culture assumes formation occurs primarily or even solely through the mind. That's a faulty idea produced by the Enlightenment. Heart formation occurs best by being immersed in a culture that embraces 5 key elements: time, habit, community, intimacy, and instruction. So we may find ourselves at a bit of a disadvantage. The local church doesn't normally provide this type of 5-element community. The average American lifestyle works against us, and Christian institutions are often more focused on the institution than on the individual. So many of us sort of fend for ourselves, though we're not really built for self-directed discipleship. Spiritual formation is a cooperative relationship, best experienced with God and with other people. So we exist in a formation gap of sorts. We're missing some of these 5 elements critical to our discipleship. This formation gap produces malformed Christians. Instead of becoming more like Jesus, we tend to just get stuck without a clear vision or context or path to our discipleship journey. Now, we might argue that the family today, not the church, is really our primary culture of discipleship. And we have talked at length about how important family of origin is in our formation. But there are 2 problems with assuming that the modern family is the center of our spiritual formation. One, the institution of the family is struggling and being attacked from every side. Our culture is now suffering from multi-generational dysfunction and harm and malformation. We can no longer assume the family is a secure and healthy formative environment. There's just too many signs of brokenness and woundedness to automatically make that assumption. And 2, for various reasons, the idea that our spiritual formation in the home magically stops at age 18 is a somewhat modern convention. For most of human history, the so-called nuclear family remained geographically and relationally close, even as young family members reached adulthood. Multiple generations may have lived in the same house, or at least in the same village or city. There was a much deeper, longer experience of family relationships than what typically exists today. We send off our kids to college or the military or the workforce around age 18, and the underlying assumption is that they're now set free to start their own families. But as anyone who's raised teenagers knows, the average 18-year-old may or may not be spiritually formed enough to move on from the immersive community of their family of origin. I'm not arguing for the rightness or wrongness of how the family has evolved in our culture. I'm saying that the departure of most 18-year-olds from the original family unit contributes to the formation gap. Spiritual formation is a lifelong journey, but we send off our 18-year-olds to continue to be formed where? The college, the workforce, the local church? If we truly want to grow to be more like Jesus, we should consider intentionally seeking out small communities where it's safe and healthy to dig into these ideas that govern us, communities designed for deep discipleship. At Wrestled Roots, we help form and support a type of these immersive 5-element communities, and we call them greenhouses. At the moment, though, most of us don't have access to these types of communities, and most of us don't even know we need them. So we need to work together to recreate them. The stakes are just too high. We're about to see how high the stakes really are as we dig into our example today, a core idea of value. I love visual aids, and there's another one available for you that pertains to today's episode. You can find it on the resources tab at wrestled.org. You'll see a document called Human Value Comparison for episode 10. If you can, print it off and have it in front of you. You don't have to do any homework because the answers are already filled in, so you're welcome. We're going to contrast an idea of human value today from the kingdom of light and from the kingdom of darkness. We're going to uncover just how radically different each kingdom's ideas are. We're going to explore 8 critical questions related to both kingdoms' idea of human value, so you can just follow along on the handout. So here are the 8 questions. Who gives us value? Is our value intrinsic or extrinsic? I'll explain that. How valuable are we? Why do we have value? Can our value change? What factors impact our value? How long does our value last? And what are the cultural impacts of these ideas of value? So let's just quickly clarify what we mean by the word value. The easiest way to answer that is just worth. What are you and I worth? We're talking about our inherent worth as unique human beings. All right, so let's answer these 8 questions regarding our value, our worth, according to the kingdom of light. So number 1, who gives us our value in the kingdom of light? Well, the Sunday school answer and the correct answer is God. We don't give ourselves value. Our value is instilled in us by our Creator. It's perhaps the most liberating thing about the kingdom of light's idea of human value is that we aren't responsible for it. If you're lucky enough to own a Van Gogh, the painting isn't valuable because you own it. It's valuable because of who created it. Jessica and I are passionate Pittsburgh Steelers fans, and over the years we've collected some signed Steelers items. So we have items signed by Lynn Swann, Chuck Noll, Hines Ward, Jack Lambert. Those items aren't valuable because I own them. They're valuable because of who signed them. Number 2, is our value intrinsic or extrinsic? So these terms are often used in investments and money, but they're also used in ethics. The intrinsic value of something is said to be the value that this thing has in itself, or for its own sake, or as such in its own right. Meaning, we're valuable because of what we are. In this case, we have value solely because we are human. The kingdom of light maintains that our value is intrinsic. We're valuable because of our nature, human beings hand-woven by a loving creator. Question 3, how valuable are we? According to the kingdom of light, you have extraordinary intrinsic value. G.K. Chesterton said that the hardest thing to accept in the Christian religion is the great value it places upon the individual soul. C.S. Lewis famously said, "There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit." Question 4, why do we have value? The primary reason is because we are hand-woven in the image of our Creator. Now, we could do about 50 episodes on that one statement and still not fully explore it, but human beings are the only created thing made in the image of our Creator. We bear the mark of our Creator. We share some of His characteristics. We are a unique and valuable race for other reasons. We are the highest of all the created beings, and God gives us a very special role to manage and steward His creation on His behalf. But not only is our race unique, you are entirely unique. There is and only will be one you. There has never been a you in the past. There isn't anyone like you right now, and there will never be another you in the future. You are a singularly unique, extraordinary work of a divine artist, and He doesn't make copies. If you question whether you're valuable, consider this. We're so valuable that, despite ourselves, God has filled all of His creation with His ideas, constantly inviting us into an intimate, eternal relationship with Him. Question 5. Can our value fluctuate? Well, in the kingdom of light, the answer is no. Our intrinsic value can't fluctuate because it isn't determined by us. Here's a simple formula to help us remember that. The zygote equals the 5-year-old equals the 105-year-old. I'll say it again. The zygote equals the 5-year-old equals the 105-year-old. Our extraordinary value remains on an equal continuum from conception onward. We're members of the human race the moment we're conceived, and we obviously remain a human throughout into eternity. Number 6, what factors impact our value? So here's a new term, a valuation factor. It's any characteristic that changes our worth. But in the kingdom of light, there is only one valuation factor, and that is our humanity. So we can compare human worth with the value of other created things like plants or trees and elephants. But in the kingdom of light, a human being is more valuable than a tree. But we don't contrast one human being's value with another human being because we all have extraordinary intrinsic value. Number 7, how long does our value last? Well, if we're citizens of the kingdom of light, our value persists forever. We're valuable at conception, and that value continues forever even after death. And lastly, what are the cultural results of this idea of human value? Well, when a culture holds to the idea that all human beings are extraordinarily valuable and doesn't apply any valuation factors to us, that society will extend special care and provision to weak and marginalized populations. A society that considers the infirm to be as valuable as the healthy will provide and protect for the infirm with special honor and care. A society that considers the preborn to be as valuable as the born will extend itself to protect and provide for the preborn and their families. A society that considers a healthy 40-year-old producer to be as valuable as the 90-year-old consumer will extend dignity and honor to the 90-year-old regardless of their production. In other words, the culture that holds to this idea will form itself around the idea. Its laws will protect all human life because it considers all human life to be extraordinarily valuable. All 7 mountains of culture will instill and promote this idea. Media, the arts, business, the church, government, education will embody the ethics and principles that naturally flow from the idea that we are valuable solely because of our human nature. Okay, so let's answer the same 8 questions about this idea of human value from the perspective of the kingdom of darkness. So in the kingdom of darkness, who gives value? Well, if God doesn't give us value, then the only answer that's left is people in power. In the kingdom of darkness, value is assigned to weaker groups by more powerful groups. This has played out on the world stage since the beginning of time, and we see it every day on the news. Number 2, is our value intrinsic or extrinsic? In the kingdom of darkness, our value is extrinsic. Our value isn't based on what we are, it's based on whatever society chooses. It's external assignment of value. Number 3, how valuable are we? Well, the answer depends on what value is assigned to us by the elites. We may have extraordinary value, we may have no value, or we may have negative value. Celebrities are typically assigned great value as long as they stay popular. Unwanted preborn children, though, are assigned negative value. They're seen as a drain on the social order, so they're often destroyed. By the way, their mothers are assigned the exact same negative value, which may come as a surprise to some of us, but that's a topic for another day. Number 4, why are we valuable? In the kingdom of darkness, we're valuable when we serve the purposes of those in power. If you're white, you're valuable if being white serves the purposes of those in power. If you're black, you're valuable if being black serves the purposes of the elites. Our value is determined by various factors, and those only work in our favor if they serve the interests of the powerful. Number 5, can our value fluctuate? In the kingdom of darkness, the answer is yes, and it happens all the time. Number 6, are there valuation factors? Well, the kingdom of darkness has dozens upon dozens upon dozens of valuation factors. For the sake of time, I'll just list a bunch of them, and then we can talk about one or two. So some common valuation factors are things like gender, race, economic status, size, religion, age, location, production capacity, degree of dependency, environment, health, education, desire, adherence to cultural norms, political persuasion, emotional attachment, and the list goes on and on. I haven't tried to catalog every valuation factor because there are new ones being applied all the time. Years ago, I was asked to be a guest on a popular podcast, and the host wanted a Christian who was against abortion to debate a Christian who was in favor of abortion. I was the guest against abortion, and my opponent was a female Episcopal priest who was in favor of abortion rights. During our rather civil and polite debate, the priest raised an interesting question. An in vitro fertilization clinic in San Francisco had recently experienced some sort of power problem, and as a result, about 2,000 embryos died in their cryotanks. Now, the priest asked why there wasn't an enormous public outcry about the deaths of those 2,000 embryos compared to the outcry and mourning over those who had died on 9/11. Her point was that the lack of emotional outrage at the death of the embryos proved that they were less valuable than the lives lost in New York, Pennsylvania, and D.C. Well, what was her error? She confused relational attachment with intrinsic value. She was claiming that our depth of feeling for someone impacts their inherent worth. In other words, she was applying a valuation factor to an entire population based on how we feel about them. That's an extremely dangerous idea. We all have different depths of relational attachment. If I read a news story about a terrible car accident that claimed the life of a middle-aged woman, I'd be sad. I'd say a prayer for the family. But frankly, 5 minutes later, I'm back to work and have forgotten about it. But if my wife is in a terrible car accident, I'm devastated. I'm far more deeply and relationally attached to my wife and our sons than I am to strangers on the news. But they all have extraordinary intrinsic value as human beings. My emotional attachment isn't related to their intrinsic value. Is my wife more valuable to me than a stranger? Well, from a relational standpoint, of course she is, but that isn't a claim of inherent value. It's hard to talk about value without talking about abortion, though we often miss the underlying ideas that are driving the abortion culture. Abortion employs several ideas of darkness related to human value, but the most prominent valuation factor is actually desire. Most babies who die by abortion are killed because someone at some point in time doesn't desire them. They are unwanted, at least for some period of time. Sometimes it's the mother, but oftentimes it's a boyfriend or mother or family member who coerces the young mom. If the baby is desired, there are baby showers and books and shopping trips and gender reveal parties. If the baby isn't desired, the child is killed and the mother's soul is crushed. Our society is now accustomed to applying a valuation factor of desire. If someone is wanted, they can live. If someone isn't, we can kill them. Number 7, how long does value last in the kingdom of darkness? Well, as I mentioned, if someone is a citizen of the kingdom of light, they're valuable from conception on to forever. However, if someone is a citizen of the kingdom of darkness, their value actually only lasts until death. Dallas Willard wrote, quote, "Probably the simplest way to understand hell is as a cosmic junk heap, Gehenna. It's a place for the eternally worthless. When people reject the kingdom of light, they reject the God who instills value in them. When they die, they receive what they desire, in eternity without God. But when they reject God, they also reject the source of their value. The saddest thing in the universe is humans who desperately try to find value in themselves instead of their Creator, only to lose both for eternity." And number 8, what are the cultural results of this idea? Well, when a culture rejects intrinsic value and instead values human beings based on the factors chosen by the elites, the results are chaos, confusion, death, and destruction. Abortion is the predictable and inevitable result of this type of culture. The moment our hearts embrace the idea that we instill value in others, someone's going to die. And we typically pick on our weakest and most vulnerable populations. So right now, the most persecuted people group in the world is preborn children, but mankind has picked on all sorts of people groups throughout history. This type of culture will assign different values to people based on whatever the elites determine is best. This encourages all sorts of isms, like racism, ageism, and genderism, and so forth. Various groups will declare higher value based on all sorts of factors instead of our shared humanity, and they'll prevail until another group exerts more power over them. The society will deprioritize systems and institutions that promote the welfare of the individual and smaller units of community, and replace them with systems and institutions that promote larger groups. Valuation factors always favor groups over individuals. Instead of honoring the uniqueness and beauty of the individual, valuation factors intentionally create groups and categories to strip us of our individuality. And this type of society will ignore or destroy weaker groups that don't serve the interests of the elites. So now that we've dissected this one idea of value, let's practice heart view from last episode. Let's see if we can determine the idea of human value in our own hearts. Remember, our hearts may well be holding on to ideas that our minds don't agree with. It happens all the time. Take another look at the Ideas of Human Value Guide and the Kingdom of Light. Your worth is instilled in you by God, and you are extraordinarily valuable. You are so valuable because you are hand-woven in God's image, and you are utterly, completely, and wonderfully unique. You have the same extraordinary value from the moment you were conceived throughout your earthly life, and you'll be valuable for all eternity. Your value doesn't fluctuate, and there are no other factors that impact your worth, despite what family, friends, churches, or the culture might have told you. Now, you may be saying to yourself, but I'm a sinner. Well, that's certainly true, and if you grew up in a fundamentalist or legalistic church, your heart may assume you're worth less because of your sin. But Dallas Willard said, sin does not make us worthless, but only lost. This is critical for us to understand. Are we all sinners? Yes. Does that impact our inherent value? No. Our value is determined by the fact we are humans created by God. Our sin separates us from God, but sin is not a valuation factor, it's a factor of relationship. And God went to great lengths to restore our relationships to Him and to others. The flip side is if we don't recognize our sin and think our value comes from our human goodness or our performance. It's also tragic because history has proven how awful we are at valuing each other. And when we think we add to our value, we give ourselves authority to take away somebody else's. The sweet spot is to embrace our intrinsic value and the same value in others while falling more in love with Jesus. As our hearts are formed more and more into the image of Christ, we grow to hate sin even more while still embracing the inherent value and dignity of every human being. So let's take a look at our 8 indicators: thoughts, emotions, health, actions, relationships, words, time, and money. Now, for the sake of time, we aren't going to go through each one, but let's pick a few and see if we can uncover what our own hearts embrace about our value. So let's talk about thoughts. What do you think about yourself? How do you talk to yourself? When you talk to yourself, do you talk to someone who has extraordinary intrinsic value? Someone who is utterly unique, carefully crafted as a beautiful work of art by a loving creator? I'm not talking about arrogance or deifying yourself. I'm asking if you think about yourself as an amazing creature who's deeply loved and valued by the one who handcrafted you. If you're in Christ, He delights in you. Do you think of yourself as someone whom God delights in? The way God often presents Himself in the New Testament is a loving Father. Do you think of yourself and talk to yourself as the son or daughter of a loving Father? When you mess up, do you berate yourself, or conversely, do you think of yourself as your own God and wonder why people around you don't think of you the same way? Do you talk to yourself as someone whose value is determined by your Creator, and do you rest in that fact? Let's talk about emotions and this idea of value. Emotions are very effective signposts for us to learn what's really going on in our hearts. The problem is, as we've discussed, modern Christianity is currently more concerned with the mind and typically looks down on emotions. Dr. J. Myers is the head of Summit Ministries, And in one of his books, he introduces the term simplicism. Simplicism is the habit of many Christians to use short catchphrases or memes to form universal principles. So he gives examples such as, "It's just me and Jesus," or "God said it, I believe it, that settles it," or "It's not my place to judge." Modern Christianity doesn't just employ simplicism with catchphrases, we do it with Bible verses all the time. This has led to very damaging understandings of emotions and the importance they play in our spiritual formation. Modern Christianity is fine with so-called good emotions, such as joy and happiness, but often dismisses anger or grief or anxiety or sadness. We're taught, consciously or unconsciously, that good Christians aren't allowed to feel or express these so-called negative emotions. We aren't allowed to be angry, we aren't allowed to be sad. If we feel these emotions for too long, we must be immature Christians. Well, apparently Jesus must have been an immature Christian. He got angry, he overturned tables, he got irritated, he got frustrated, he grieved, he expressed sadness. So let's just take one example. Let's take anxiety. Anxiety is plaguing modern society, even though we have more money, more technology, and more opportunities to please ourselves than any generation in human history. And anxiety is deeply impacting Christians. Adam Young proposes that anxiety is what happens when we repress or ignore emotions that our hearts are trying to express. So instead of pressing into and allowing feelings of anger and sadness and grief and frustration, we stuff them back down in our hearts, and that results in anxiety. I suspect one of the reasons that anxiety is so prevalent in Christian circles is because we've been trained to believe that emotions like anger and sadness are, quote, bad. According to Young, instead of repressing these feelings, we should be both curious and kind. We should allow ourselves to express our anger, sadness, confusion, and grief, and explore what about our stories is driving those emotions. However, we often compliment and praise someone who suffers an illness or harm or betrayal and soldiers on, saying things like, "God is good all the time God is good." We marvel at their faith and how well they're handling their suffering. But repressing our emotions is not a sign of mature faith. A faithful, mature Christian is someone who allows his or her feelings to flow freely, digs into their hearts and story carefully, and understands that God gives us our emotions, including anger, sadness, frustration, and grief. Just like Jesus, mature Christians are people of wide-ranging and passionate emotions. Just like David, they bring their anger, rage, sadness, and confusion to God, and they're not afraid to ask him the hard questions. This is why we have to be very careful with passages like, "Be anxious for nothing," and "Do not let the sun go down on your anger." Modern Christians have a strong tendency towards simplicism. We often pull isolated passages out of Scripture and create universal principles with them. It's creating the false impression of what a mature Christian is supposed to look like. So with that in mind, the key question here is whether your feelings about your value are grounded in the reality that your value has nothing to do with you or others. A person who is grounded in the reality that they have extraordinary worth because of their Creator is generally in tune with or aware of and free to express their emotions. They have a beautifully wide range of emotions. They express joy and grief, laughter, sadness, though their emotions aren't triggered by what other people think of them. They aren't fearful or anxious when people speak ill of them, and they're grateful but not overjoyed when people speak well of them. They have a deep sense of empathy and sympathy for others and are quick to enter into compassionate, meaningful relationships. They celebrate with passion, but they also mourn with those who mourn. They're free to be emotional because their hearts rest in their intrinsic value. People who try to find their value in themselves or others generally have difficulty because their emotions are deeply impacted by what others think of them. This breeds all sorts of challenges, including anxiety. Or they shut down their feelings to protect themselves and their hearts. They go numb. That never ends well because our emotions are designed to flow. Numb people who suppress their emotions often develop other issues, such as health problems or relational challenges. So let's take a moment and consider our feelings. Does your heart embrace that your value is only found in the King? And are your emotions wrongly triggered by others because you're searching for value in the created instead of the Creator? Here's another example. Let's talk about how our relationships can be indicators of how our hearts value ourselves and others. We typically form relationships with people who are like us. In some ways, they are mirrors of ourselves. So, who do you spend time with? Do the people you spend time with value you as God values you? In your circle of family and friends, do they treat you as a work of a divine artist who is beautifully and wonderfully made? In the way they speak to you, behave around you, relate to you, do they reinforce ideas of light or ideas of darkness related to human value? How do you relate to them? Do you treat your spouse, your children, your friends, your coworkers as wonderfully unique, amazing, valuable, eternal beings? Or are we applying valuation factors from the kingdom of darkness to them and maybe not even conscious of it? Do we treat wealthy people differently from people with less money? Do we intentionally try to form relationships with people in power but ignore people with no power? Are we reclusive? Are we fairly disinterested in building new relationships? Well, what does that tell us about how we value ourselves and others? It's pretty easy to determine our ideas of value in our hearts by just exploring who we build relationships with and why. Okay, so how did you do? As you look at these indicators, do you have a sense of what your heart actually embraces? Do you talk to yourself as a unique, priceless work of art? Are your emotions grounded in the fact that you have intrinsic value, or are they grounded in what others think about you? What do your relationships tell you about how you value yourself and others? Truth is, we all fall short on embracing this idea of light. We all apply filters of darkness on some human being, including ourselves. We all forget that there is no such thing as a mundane person. If we've discovered that we have some ideas of darkness in our hearts, what can be done? How do our hearts bend more towards the kingdom of light? Well, we become more like Jesus by experiencing Jesus. And the best way to do that is to immerse ourselves in a community of people who desire to do the exact same thing. A community that embraces the 5 key elements of formation: time, habit, intimacy, community, and instruction. Hey, you're a wonderful, unique, extraordinary work of a divine artist who handcrafted you to become more and more like his son. And I'm glad you listened today. If you'd like to sign up for our email list or donate to Soil and Roots, check us out at soilandroots.org, and feel free to email us with questions or comments at fish@soilandroots.org, and we'll see you next time.